A millionaire CEO encounters twin boys attempting to sell their cherished toy car to fund their mother's medical care, unknowingly setting in motion a series of events that will profoundly alter their lives. Before we begin this narrative, please share in the comments from which city you are currently watching. We hope you enjoy the story. The autumn breeze swept through Central Park, scattering dried leaves past a weathered bench where twin boys, Zach and Lucas Wilson, sat quietly. Identical down to the constellation of freckles across their noses, they huddled together against the morning's chill. Between them rested a shiny red toy car, its edges showing signs of many adventures, yet still gleaming where the sunlight caught its polished surface. "Someone has to want it," Zach whispered, his small hands nervously turning the toy over and over. "It's the coolest car ever." Lucas nodded, swallowing hard as his gaze scanned the passing crowd. His stomach rumbled with hunger, but he ignored it. They hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager breakfast, but food wasn't their primary concern now, not with their mother lying pale and weak in their tiny, threadbare apartment. "Let's try over there," Lucas suggested, pointing toward the busier path where sharply dressed business people hurried to their offices. The twins positioned themselves strategically, summoning a courage that belied their tender 10 years. Their identical blue eyes, serious and filled with a quiet determination, watched each passerby with a desperate, hopeful intensity. "Excuse me, sir," Zach called out to a man in an expensive, impeccably tailored suit. "Would you like to buy our car? It's really special." The man strode past without a flicker of acknowledgement. This disheartening pattern repeated itself throughout the morning. People rushed by, some offering fleeting, pitying glances, others studiously pretending not to see the small boys and their earnest plea. "We need to try harder," Lucas said finally, his voice breaking with a mixture of frustration and fear. "Mom needs the medicine today." Across the park, a tall, imposing figure emerged from a sleek black limousine. Blake Harrison adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit jacket, nodding curtly as his driver confirmed his afternoon meeting schedule. At 42, Blake had built Harrison Industries into a global technology empire. His name was synonymous with cutting-edge innovation and ruthless, uncompromising business acumen. "I'll walk through the park," he informed his driver. "Meet me on the east side in 15 minutes. Blake moved with his characteristic sense of purpose, his expression neutral as he mentally reviewed quarterly projections and strategic initiatives. He barely registered the people around him, lost in the complex world of his thoughts, until a small, clear voice cut through his reverie. "Sir, would you buy our car, please?" Blake's determined stride faltered. Something in that voice, its desperate sincerity, its unvarnished plea, made him stop. He turned to see twin boys looking up at him, their identical faces pinched with anxiety. One held out a toy car as if it were a precious, irreplaceable artifact. "We're selling it," the boy continued, his voice earnest. "It's really fast and the door's even open." Blake found himself staring at the twins, an unexpected tightness forming in his chest. Something about their earnest, upturned faces, the careful, almost reverent way they handled the toy, as if parting with a beloved treasure, resonated with him in a way he couldn't immediately comprehend or explain. "How much?" Blake heard himself ask, the words surprising even him. The twins exchanged quick, hopeful glances. "Whatever you can pay," the one holding the car answered, his voice small but firm. "We just need it for our mom, she's really sick." Blake's gaze lingered on the toy car. It was obviously cherished, meticulously cleaned despite its evident age, with clear, tiny fingerprints showing where small hands had gripped it countless times during imaginative play. Without fully understanding why, he reached for his wallet and removed several large bills. "Here," he said, extending the money. "Will this help?" The boys' eyes widened at the amount, far more than they had dared to hope for. Zach carefully placed the toy car in Blake's outstretched palm, his small fingers lingering for a moment before reluctantly pulling away. "Thank you, sir," Lucas said, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "This will help our mom a lot." Blake pocketed the car, watching as the twins gripped the money tightly and hurried away, their heads bent together in urgent, whispered conversation. He should have continued his walk, returned to the pressing demands of his day's agenda, and forgotten this brief, insignificant interaction. Instead, he found himself watching the boys' retreating figures, those identical small heads, so focused, so determined. Blake turned to his driver, who had followed at a discreet, unobtrusive distance. "Follow them," he said quietly, surprising himself with the unexpected command. "I want to see where they live." As his car moved slowly, Almost surreptitiously, behind the hurrying twins, Blake stared at the toy car now resting in his hand. It had been years, a lifetime it seemed, since anything had so profoundly disrupted his carefully ordered, meticulously controlled existence. Years since he had felt this inexplicable pull, this undeniable need to understand something beyond profit margins, market shares, and strategic acquisitions. Blake Harrison didn't believe in fate or coincidence, but as he watched those twin boys through the tinted window of his limousine, he couldn't shake the persistent, unsettling feeling that something truly significant had just happened. Something that would, in ways he couldn't yet fathom, change everything. Blake's car trailed the twins to a dilapidated apartment building, nestled in one of the city's forgotten, neglected neighborhoods. The stark contrast between his sleek, luxurious vehicle and the crumbling, decaying surroundings couldn't have been more pronounced. As the boys disappeared inside the building's grimy entrance, Blake sat motionless, the small red toy car still clutched in his hand. "Wait here," he instructed his driver, stepping out before he could reconsider his impulsive decision. The building's narrow stairwell smelled strongly of mildew and a pervasive sense of despair. Blake climbed 4 flights of rickety stairs, following the faint sound of excited children's voices, until he reached a door with peeling paint and a loose, rattling handle. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked firmly. The door opened slightly, revealing one of the twins, his face a mask of suspicion. "It's the man from the park," he called over his shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and alarm. The door opened wider, and both boys stood there, uncertainty clearly written across their identical, apprehensive faces. Behind them, Blake glimpsed a small, sparsely furnished apartment and the faint outline of a woman lying on a mattress on the floor. "Can I come in?" Blake asked, his usual commanding tone softened by an unfamiliar note of concern. After a moment's hesitation, the boys stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Inside, the apartment was surprisingly clean, despite its evident poverty. What struck Blake most, however, was what was missing. No excess, no comforts, just the bare, unadorned necessities of survival. "My mom's sleeping," one twin whispered. Lucas, Blake thought, though he wasn't entirely certain, their resemblance was so complete. Catherine Wilson lay on a thin, worn mattress, her breathing labored, her skin an ashen, unhealthy hue against the faded, threadbare sheets. Even in illness, her resemblance to her son's was unmistakable. The same delicate, finely chiseled features, though her once vibrant, expressive face was now hollowed out by suffering and neglect. "How long has she been like this?" Blake asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Weeks," Zach answered, his small shoulders sagging with a weight no child should have to bear. "She gets worse every day." Blake knelt beside the mattress, gently touching Catherine's arm. Her skin burned with fever. "She needs a hospital," he said decisively, his voice regaining some of its familiar authority. "We don't have any money," Lucas replied, his voice small, almost inaudible. "That's why we were selling our car." Blake looked at the toy car still in his pocket, then at the desperate, imploring faces of the twins. Something inside him, something he thought long buried, long forgotten, stirred to life. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. The boys exchanged uncertain glances. "How will we ever pay you back?" Zach asked, clutching the money they had earned, their only tangible asset. Blake's expression softened unexpectedly. "You already sold me your car, remember? Now it's my turn to help." Without waiting for their response, Blake lifted Catherine gently, carefully in his arms. She mumbled something incoherent, too weak to resist. The twins followed anxiously as Blake carried their mother down the precarious stairs and into his waiting car. "Where are we going?" Lucas asked, his small hand clutching his mother's limp one as the car pulled away from the curb. "To people who can help her," Blake answered, already dialing a number on his phone. As the limousine navigated the city streets, Blake found himself wondering what had possessed him to become so deeply involved. For years, he had meticulously constructed walls around himself, focusing solely on his empire, avoiding anything, anyone, that might reawaken the profound pain he had buried so deep within his soul. Yet something about these twin boys, their quiet desperation, their unwavering love for their mother, had breached those formidable defenses. Looking at their worried, innocent faces in the back seat, Blake understood with a startling, undeniable clarity that his carefully isolated, meticulously controlled life had just become irrevocably, inextricably entangled with theirs. The emergency room doors slid open automatically as Blake carried Catherine inside, the twins trailing anxiously behind him. His commanding presence, his air of inherent authority, cut through the usual waiting room procedures. And within minutes, doctors were examining Catherine while nurses gently guided the concerned boys to nearby chairs. Severe dehydration, probable kidney failure, a doctor murmured, checking Catherine's vital signs with practiced efficiency. How long has she been like this? They say weeks, Blake replied, his gaze fixed on the medical team as they worked with focused, efficient urgency. Will she recover? The doctor's expression remained professionally neutral, offering no easy reassurances. She needs immediate intensive treatment. Are you family? Blake hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Yes, he answered firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Tests confirmed the doctor's initial, grim assessment. Severe kidney disease, requiring immediate dialysis. Blake authorized all necessary treatments without a moment's hesitation, signing forms and providing his insurance information as if he had been caring for Catherine, for this family, his entire life. Hours later, Blake found himself sitting between the exhausted, emotionally drained twins in a quiet hospital corridor. The boys leaned against him, fighting sleep, but ultimately losing the battle. Neither had left their mother's side until the doctors had gently but firmly insisted they step out during a complicated procedure. Is Mom going to die? Lucas whispered, his small voice cracking with unshed tears. Blake looked down at the boy, seeing a fear in those wide blue eyes that seemed far too profound, far too knowing for their tender years. No, he said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel, but knew they needed to hear. She's getting the best care possible now. But what happens after? Zach asked, his voice equally concerned, equally fragile. We can't stay at the hospital forever. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Blake had been so focused on getting Catherine the immediate medical treatment she desperately needed that he hadn't considered what would come next. The thought of sending these children back to that barren, desolate apartment while their mother recovered was, quite simply, unthinkable. You'll come stay with me? Blake heard himself say, the words forming, escaping his lips before he had fully considered their implications. Just until your mother is better. The twins exchanged doubtful, uncertain glances. Your house must be really big, Lucas said after a moment, trying to imagine it. It is, Blake confirmed, feeling strangely self-conscious about his immense wealth for the first time in many years. Plenty of room for both of you. When Catherine was finally stabilized and sleeping peacefully, a nurse approached with paperwork and questions about child care arrangements. Blake smoothly took charge, explaining that the boys would be staying with him, his confident, authoritative tone leaving no room for argument or suspicion. As they prepared to leave, Blake watched the twins say goodbye to their unconscious mother, each placing a gentle, tender kiss on her forehead with a quiet reverence that tightened his chest. These children, who had every reason to be broken, to be bitter by circumstance, showed a resilience, a depth of love that stirred something long dormant, long forgotten within him. The drive to Blake's sprawling estate was silent, the twins pressed together in the back seat, occasionally whispering to each other in hushed, conspiratorial tones as the gritty city landscape gradually gave way to manicured, affluent suburbs, and eventually the private, tree-lined road leading to Blake's imposing mansion. When the car finally stopped before the grand, formidable structure, the boys' exhaustion momentarily lifted, replaced by a wide-eyed awe at the sheer size of the house, illuminated by subtle, strategically placed landscape lighting. You live here, alone? Zach asked, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief as they stepped out of the car. Blake nodded, suddenly seeing his home, his sanctuary, through their innocent, unjaded eyes. Grand, certainly, impressive undoubtedly, but also utterly, profoundly empty of what truly mattered. Not tonight, he said quietly, leading them toward the massive, intricately carved front doors. Tonight, you're here too. Morning light streamed through tall, arched windows as Zach and Lucas cautiously explored their temporary, bewilderingly grand home. The mansion's opulence overwhelmed them. Crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls from vaulted cathedral ceilings, priceless artwork adorning every wall, pieces worth more than their entire life's meager possessions, and long, echoing corridors leading to seemingly endless, sumptuously furnished rooms. Do you think he has a pool? Lucas whispered excitedly, his eyes wide with anticipation. Probably 3, Zach replied, running his small hand along a smooth, cool marble banister. The boys had slept in a guest suite larger than their entire cramped apartment, in beds so soft, so luxurious they'd felt as if they were floating on clouds. Despite their deep concern for their mother, a childish sense of wonder, of adventure, temporarily overtook their worry as they discovered each new, astonishing corner of Blake's vast estate. Blake watched them from his study doorway, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. He'd already made several calls that morning, arranging for Catherine's continued, intensive medical treatment, postponing important meetings, and instructing his housekeeper to purchase all the necessary supplies for the twins. He couldn't explain his actions, even to himself. They felt instinctual, necessary. "The hospital called," Blake announced, as the boys rounded a corner, their explorations momentarily paused. "Your mother is stable. She's responding well to the treatment." Both small faces lit up with identical expressions of profound relief. "Can we see her today?" Lucas asked hopefully, his voice eager. "This afternoon," Blake promised. "Have you eaten?" The twins shook their heads, their earlier excitement now tinged with a sudden awareness of their hunger. Blake led them to the kitchen, where his housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, had prepared a hearty breakfast. The woman raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow at the unlikely, unexpected house guests, but said nothing as she served plates piled high with fluffy pancakes, crispy bacon, and fresh fruit. "Eat," Blake instructed, checking his phone as messages and alerts accumulated. The boys needed no further encouragement, devouring the meal with a barely concealed, almost desperate hunger. Later, as Blake attempted to answer a backlog of emails, he heard a commotion outside his study. "You can't go in there," Mrs. Winters was saying firmly, her voice tinged with a note of alarm. Blake opened the door to find Zach attempting to peer around the housekeeper into a room at the end of the hall, a room Blake kept permanently, inviolably locked. "That door is always closed," Mrs. Winters explained apologetically, her face flushed. "I tried to tell them." "It's fine," Blake interrupted, his voice suddenly tight, strained. To the twins, he added, his tone now cold, almost harsh. "That room is private. The rest of the house is yours to explore, but that room remains closed. Understood?" Both boys nodded, chastened, visibly subdued by his sudden, unexpected coldness. That afternoon, Blake's driver took them to the hospital. Catherine was awake, though still visibly weak, her face brightening instantly at the sight of her sons. "My boys," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as they carefully, gently hugged her. "I was so worried." "Mr. Harrison is letting us stay at his house, Mom," Lucas explained excitedly. "It's huge." Catherine's eyes found Blake, who stood uncomfortably, awkwardly at the doorway. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with a gratitude that made him shift uneasily. "There's no need," Blake replied, his tone stiff, almost dismissive. The doctor arrived with updates, explaining Catherine's condition in simplified, reassuring terms for the twins. "Your mom's kidneys weren't working properly," he explained gently. "We're helping them filter her blood while they heal." "Will she get better?" Zach asked, his small hand clutching his mother's, his knuckles white. "With continued treatment, yes," the doctor confirmed, "but it will take time." On the drive back to the mansion, the twins were quiet, subdued, processing their mother's condition, the uncertainty of her recovery. "Why are you helping us?" Lucas finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. Blake stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of lights and shadows. Why indeed? He'd spent years, a significant portion of his adult life, meticulously building impenetrable walls around himself, focusing solely, exclusively on his ever-expanding empire. Why risk the pain, the vulnerability by letting these strangers, these innocent, heartbreakingly vulnerable strangers, into his carefully guarded, emotionally barren life? "Sometimes people just need help," he answered eventually, avoiding the deeper, more complex truth, a truth he wasn't yet ready to confront, even within himself. That night after the twins were asleep, Blake stood before the locked door, the key cold and heavy in his hand. Inside was everything he'd tried so desperately to forget: photos, toys, memories, preserved like fragile insects in amber, a testament to a life, a love, a happiness that had been brutally, irrevocably shattered. His fingers tightened around the key, then slowly, agonizingly released it. Not tonight, perhaps not ever. Behind him, the house felt different. No longer just an empty, soulless monument to his success, but temporarily, unexpectedly, alive with the presence of children again. The sensation was both deeply comforting and utterly, profoundly terrifying. A week passed, settling into an unexpected, almost surreal rhythm. Each morning, Blake found himself waking earlier than usual, listening intently for the subtle sounds of life in his formerly silent, echoing home. The twins' soft footsteps on the polished wooden floors, their whispered, conspiratorial conversations, even their occasional, quickly resolved disagreements, had become an intrinsic, strangely comforting part of the mansion's new, unfamiliar soundtrack. Blake's staff adapted with their customary professional efficiency, though not without a discernible undercurrent of curiosity. Mrs. Winters, the unflappable housekeeper, stocked the kitchen with an array of child-friendly foods, while the stoic groundskeeper found himself patiently answering endless questions about the intricate workings of the gardens from two identical inquisitive shadows that followed him around like devoted acolytes. "Mr. Harrison," Zach approached Blake as he worked diligently in his home office, his small face serious, his brow furrowed with concern. "Can we visit Mom today?" Blake checked his watch, a rare concession to the passage of time outside the realm of business. "We'll go after lunch. How's the guest suite working out for you both?" "It's awesome," Zach replied, his eyes brightening instantly. "Lucas found a chess set in the closet. Do you play?" Blake's fingers stilled on his keyboard, a forgotten skill, a painful memory surfacing unexpectedly. "I used to." "Could you teach us sometime?" The boy's hopeful, expectant expression made declining feel almost cruel, an act of unnecessary unkindness. "Perhaps," Blake answered, his voice carefully neutral as he returned to his work. Zach lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, before retreating, leaving Blake alone with an unexpected, disquieting surge of emotion. At the hospital, Catherine's improvement was visibly evident. A healthy color had returned to her cheeks, and she sat up in bed, embracing her sons warmly as they bounded eagerly into the room. "The doctors say I'm responding well to the treatment," she told Blake, as the twins explored the confines of the small hospital room with their boundless energy. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Don't," Blake interrupted, his tone firm, almost abrupt. "Focus on your recovery." Later, as the twins chatted animatedly with a friendly nurse, Catherine studied Blake more carefully, her gaze perceptive, almost unnervingly so. "You don't have children of your own?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle. Blake's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "No," he answered, his voice flat. Then, after a brief, pregnant pause, "Not anymore." Catherine's eyes widened slightly at the profound, unspoken implication of his words. But before she could respond, Lucas called for her attention, breaking the fragile, emotionally charged moment. That evening dinner at the mansion was abruptly interrupted by a loud crash emanating from the living room. Blake and Mrs. Winters rushed in to find Zach standing horrified before the shattered, irreparable remains of a priceless antique vase. "I'm so sorry," the boy stammered, his eyes wide with fear, his face pale. "I was just looking. I didn't mean to." Blake surveyed the damage. The vase, a rare, exquisite piece he'd acquired at a prestigious auction years ago, lay in 1,000 glittering, useless pieces on the expensive Persian rug. "Are you hurt?" he asked calmly, his voice surprisingly devoid of anger. Zach shook his head, clearly expecting a stern reprimand, perhaps even punishment. "Good," Blake said. "Mrs. Winters, please clean this up." To Zach's utter astonishment, Blake simply turned and walked back toward the dining room, his demeanor unchanged. "Aren't you mad?" Zach asked, following cautiously, his voice barely a whisper. Blake paused at the doorway. "It's just a thing," he said, his voice quiet. "Things can be replaced." Later that night, unable to sleep, Blake wandered the darkened, silent house. Passing the twins' room, he heard soft, choked sobbing. He hesitated for a moment, then quietly, cautiously opened the door. Lucas sat awake in bed, tears streaming down his small, pale face. Zach slept soundly, blissfully unaware, in the adjacent bed. "What's wrong?" Blake asked, keeping his voice low, gentle. "I miss Mom," Lucas whispered, his voice raw with grief. "What if she doesn't get better?" Blake sat carefully on the edge of the bed, the unfamiliar intimacy of the situation making him feel awkward, out of his depth. "The doctors are very good. She's already improving significantly." Lucas looked up, his tear-stained face vulnerable, almost heartbreaking in the dim, shadowy light. "Our dad died when we were 5, he said, his voice barely audible. "Mom said sometimes people just don't come back." The simple, unadorned statement, delivered with a child's devastating honesty, hit Blake with an unexpected, visceral force. Without thinking, he reached out awkwardly, patting the boy's trembling shoulder. "Your mother is coming back," he promised, the words carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "Try to sleep now." As he closed the door softly behind him, Blake felt something shift, something crack inside him, a fissure in the carefully constructed, impenetrable fortress he'd built around his heart, letting in both a familiar, aching pain and something else, something new, something he wasn't yet ready to name or acknowledge. 2 weeks into their unexpected cohabitation, the grand, austere mansion had undergone a noticeable transformation. School books now littered the polished surface of the formal dining table, as Blake had arranged for temporary, intensive homeschooling for the boys. Children's brightly colored jackets hung incongruously beside expensive, custom-tailored coats in the otherwise immaculate foyer. The pristine, almost sterile silence that had once defined the house had given way to lively, animated chatter, and the occasional, infectious burst of laughter. Today brought news they had all been anxiously, hopefully waiting for. Catherine was being released from the hospital for outpatient treatment. Blake's driver brought her directly from the hospital. The twins, practically bouncing with impatient excitement, waited by the front door, their small faces pressed against the glass, until they finally spotted the familiar black car approaching up the long, winding driveway. "Mom!" they shouted in unison, rushing down the wide stone steps as Catherine emerged from the car, still thin, still pale, but standing straight, a nascent strength returning to her weary frame, a healthy color slowly returning to her face. Blake watched from the doorway, a silent, unobtrusive observer as the small family embraced, a poignant tableau of love and relief. He felt strangely like an outsider, a privileged witness to something precious, something deeply personal. Catherine looked up, her eyes meeting his, and smiled, a genuine, heartfelt warmth radiating from her that made something in his chest tighten, unexpectedly, almost painfully. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice carefully neutral as they approached. "This is overwhelming," Catherine admitted, taking in the sheer grandeur of the mansion, her voice still weak but filled with a quiet awe. "We can't possibly impose any further." "You're not imposing," Blake interrupted, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "The doctor said you need complete rest and continued, consistent treatment. This is the most practical, logical arrangement." Mrs. Winters, the ever-efficient housekeeper, appeared at that moment, offering to show Catherine to her room. The twins immediately, enthusiastically, volunteered as tour guides, eager to show their mother everything they had discovered, every nook and cranny of their temporary, bewilderingly grand home. That evening, for the first time, all four of them ate dinner together in the formal dining room. The twins dominated the conversation, excitedly updating Catherine on their adventures, their discoveries, their temporary life within the mansion's imposing walls. The sprawling gardens they had explored, the intricate chess lessons Blake had reluctantly, unexpectedly begun giving them, the distant planets Blake's powerful telescope could reveal in the vast, star-dusted night sky. "You've been teaching them chess?" Catherine asked Blake, during a rare, brief pause in the boys' animated narrative. Blake nodded, feeling uncharacteristically uncomfortable under her direct, perceptive scrutiny. They asked. "He's really good, Mom," Lucas added enthusiastically. "He says we're learning fast because we have good, spatial." He looked at Blake for help, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "Spatial reasoning," Blake supplied, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Catherine smiled. "They've always been quick learners." Her expression turned serious, a shadow passing over her still pale features. "But we need to discuss what happens next. The doctor says I'll need ongoing treatment for months, and I need to find work, a job that can accommodate my medical needs, my recovery." "One step at a time," Blake interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Your treatment schedule is arranged, everything else can wait." Later, after the twins had finally, reluctantly gone to bed, Blake found Catherine in the library, her gaze fixed on the carefully curated family photos displayed on a high shelf, images of Blake's parents, of his business achievements, with conspicuous, telling gaps, absences that spoke volumes. "Thank you," she said, without turning, her voice soft. "Not just for the medical care, though that has been a lifesaver, but for making my boys feel safe, secure. They've had so little stability in their young lives." Blake remained in the doorway, a silent, brooding figure. "They're remarkable children." "They mentioned a locked room," Catherine said carefully, her voice neutral. "They think it might be filled with treasure." Blake's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Just storage," he lied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Catherine turned then, studying him with a gentle, knowing perception that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. "I understand privacy, Mr. Harrison. We all have parts of ourselves, chapters of our lives we keep locked away." The simple, unadorned understanding in her voice, her quiet acceptance, nearly undid him. For years, colleagues and associates, even those closest to him, had tiptoed around his past, treating him like a ticking bomb, a fragile, unpredictable entity. Catherine's straightforward, empathetic acknowledgement was, in its own way, profoundly disarming. "Blake," he said suddenly, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of formal address. "Please call me Blake." She nodded. "Blake, then." An awkward, charged silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions, unspoken emotions. "I should rest," Catherine finally said, breaking the spell. "Good night, Blake." After she left, Blake poured himself a drink, a rare indulgence, contemplating how quickly, how completely these strangers had infiltrated, had breached his carefully constructed, meticulously maintained solitude. The most disturbing realization, the one that truly unnerved him, wasn't that he minded their presence, their intrusion into his ordered, predictable life. It was that he was beginning to dread, with a growing, undeniable intensity, their eventual, inevitable departure. Out of habit, his hand reached into his pocket, where he still inexplicably carried the twins' small, battered toy car. He examined it under the soft glow of the lamp, running his thumb over its worn, chipped edges, wondering how something so small, so insignificant, could have triggered such a profound, seismic disruption to his life, his world, his carefully guarded heart. Blake sat alone in his cavernous office, the quarterly reports lying forgotten, unread on his expansive mahogany desk. Outside, he could hear the distinct, joyful sounds of the twins laughing as they kicked a soccer ball across the meticulously manicured lawn. The sound, so full of life, of innocent exuberance, penetrated the thick, soundproof windows, infiltrating the sacrosanct sanctuary he had maintained, inviolate for so many years. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's release from the hospital. Her strength returned gradually, steadily, but her dedicated medical team insisted on continued, closely monitored rest between her outpatient treatments. The temporary living arrangement, initially conceived as a short-term solution, showed no signs of ending soon, a fact that left Blake feeling increasingly, uncomfortably conflicted. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from his ever-efficient executive assistant. "Board meeting tomorrow, 9:00 a.m. Please confirm attendance." Blake stared at the screen, his mind a whirl of competing thoughts and emotions. He'd been working remotely for the most part, making only occasional, necessary appearances at the office. His prolonged absence, his uncharacteristic detachment, had undoubtedly sparked rumors, whispers of concern, which his loyal team had managed, with their usual discretion and efficiency. Yet the truth that he, Blake Harrison, the ruthless, uncompromising business titan, was currently playing host, protector, and tentative father figure to a struggling single mother and her irrepressible twin sons, would be utterly incomprehensible, almost laughably absurd to his hard-nosed, results-driven colleagues. "Confirmed," he typed, then set the phone aside, a strange sense of resignation settling over him. The office door opened slowly, cautiously, and Lucas peered in, his small face serious. "Mr. Blake, Mom said to tell you dinner's ready." Catherine had insisted on cooking whenever she felt strong enough, a quiet, determined effort to earn her keep, as she'd explained, despite Blake's repeated, somewhat exasperated protests. Her simple, home-cooked meals, so different from the elaborate, catered affairs he was accustomed to, had become strangely, unexpectedly meaningful, bringing them all together around the formal dining table each evening in a semblance of normal family life. "I'll be right there," Blake replied, his voice softer than usual. Lucas hesitated, lingering in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Blake nodded, gesturing for the boy to enter. "Why do you always keep that toy car in your pocket, the one we sold you?" Blake's hand instinctively, almost unconsciously, touched his jacket pocket, where the small, battered red car indeed rested. He hadn't realized the boy, with his unnervingly perceptive gaze, had noticed. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly, the truth of his own inexplicable attachment to the toy surprising even him. Lucas approached, stopping respectfully before the imposing desk. "It was our dad's," he said quietly, his voice filled with a child's simple, unadorned grief. "He gave it to us before he died." Blake felt a sharp, unexpected stab of guilt. "I didn't know you should have it back." Lucas shook his head, his expression resolute. "We sold it. Fair. Mom says a deal is a deal." He studied Blake curiously, his blue eyes, so like his mother's, wide and questioning. "Did you have kids? Is that why you have that locked room?" The directness, the innocent audacity of the question knocked the air from Blake's lungs. In the cutthroat corporate world, no one, absolutely no one, dared to mention his past, his tragedy so bluntly, so openly. "I did," he admitted, the words feeling foreign, almost alien on his tongue. "A son." "What happened to him?" Blake should have shut down the conversation immediately, changed the subject, retreated behind the familiar, impenetrable walls he'd so carefully constructed. Instead, inexplicably, he heard himself answer, "There was an accident, a car accident. He and my wife. They were killed." Lucas absorbed this devastating information with a solemn, unnerving understanding that seemed far beyond his tender years. "That's why you helped us, isn't it?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "Because we reminded you of him." Blake looked away, profoundly uncomfortable with the boy's astute, almost painful perception. "Perhaps. Mom says people come into our lives for a reason," Lucas continued, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe we came into yours to help you too." Before Blake could respond, Zach appeared at the door, his face bright, expectant. "Come on, Mom made spaghetti." Lucas smiled, his earlier solemnity vanishing, and followed his brother out of the room. At the doorway, he turned back. "You should come too, Mr. Blake. It's better when we're all together." Dinner that night was animated, lively, the twins recounting their afternoon soccer game with uninhibited enthusiasm, while Catherine smiled, her gaze soft, as she listened to their excited chatter. Blake observed quietly, a silent participant in their shared warmth, struck by how the formal, imposing dining room, previously used only for rare, sterile business dinners, had transformed almost magically into a space of genuine, palpable warmth, of easy, unforced connection. "The boys tell me you have a board meeting tomorrow," Catherine said, as the twins cleared the dishes, insisting on helping despite Mrs. Winter's gentle, amused protests. "Yes," Blake confirmed, his mind already shifting reluctantly to the demands of the coming day. "I should be back by evening." Catherine nodded. "We'll manage fine. It's good for you to return to your normal life." But as Blake looked around the table at the remnants of their shared meal, at the bright, expectant faces of the twins, at Catherine's quiet, steady presence, he realized with a startling, disquieting clarity that this improvised, unexpected family dinner, with people who had been complete strangers mere weeks ago, felt more like normal life than anything he had experienced in years. The realization, so potent, so undeniable, terrified him. The board meeting dragged on interminably. Blake found himself repeatedly, almost compulsively, checking his watch, his mind wandering, drifting back to the mansion and its temporary, increasingly permanent-feeling residents. When his chief financial officer, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail, asked a pointed question about quarterly projections, Blake had to request the question be repeated, an unprecedented, almost shocking lapse in his legendary, unwavering focus. "Everything all right, Blake?" his chief operating officer asked during a brief, much-needed break, genuine concern evident in his voice. "Fine," Blake replied curtly, his tone dismissive, effectively ending the inquiry. "Let's finish this." By the time he finally returned home, evening had fallen, casting long, dancing shadows across the manicured lawns. The mansion was unusually, almost unnervingly, quiet as he entered. Following the faint, indistinct sound of hushed voices, he found Catherine in the twins' room, sitting beside Zach's bed, her hand resting gently on his forehead. "What happened?" Blake asked, his voice sharp with a sudden, inexplicable anxiety as he saw the boy's flushed, feverish face. "Fever," Catherine explained, worry deeply etched in her features. "It came on suddenly this afternoon." Zach managed a weak, wan smile. "Hi, Mr. Blake." Lucas sat cross-legged on his own bed, his small face a mask of anxious concern as he watched his brother. "He threw up, twice," he reported solemnly, his voice filled with a child's grave importance. Blake approached, nodding Zach's glazed eyes and labored, shallow breathing. Without a moment's hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed his personal physician. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, Blake announced, after a brief, concise conversation. Catherine looked up, startled, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "A house call? That's not necessary." "It is," Blake interrupted, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "We don't know if this is related to your condition or if it's something contagious. It's better to be cautious." The doctor, after a thorough examination, confirmed it was just a common virus, prescribing rest, fluids, and a watchful eye. Yet, even after this reassuring diagnosis, Blake found himself returning to check on Zach throughout the long, restless night, an inexplicable, almost primal anxiety gripping him each time he walked away from the boy's bedside. During one such visit, in the quiet, pre-dawn hours, he found Catherine asleep in the chair beside Zach's bed, her hand still resting protectively on her son's forehead. In sleep, the accumulated strain of recent months, the constant worry, the relentless uncertainty showed plainly on her face. Blake quietly, gently draped a soft blanket over her shoulders, then stood for a long moment, watching both mother and child, an unfamiliar, poignant ache spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. The next morning, Zach's fever had broken. Blake, without a second thought, canceled all his meetings again, working from home while periodically, almost obsessively, checking on the boy's recovery. By afternoon, Zach was sitting up in bed, sipping ginger ale, while Lucas, his usual exuberant self, entertained him with a series of wildly exaggerated, imaginative stories. "You didn't have to stay home," Catherine said, finding Blake in his study later that day, her voice soft, filled with an unspoken gratitude. "We could have managed." Blake looked up from his laptop, his gaze direct, unwavering. "I wanted to be sure he was recovering." Catherine studied him with that perceptive, almost unnerving gaze that always made him feel transparent, exposed. "You care about them." It wasn't a question, but a simple, undeniable statement of fact. Blake closed his laptop, struggling with how to respond, with how to articulate the complex, unfamiliar emotions churning within him. "The boys have started calling you Mr. Blake instead of Mr. Harrison," she continued, her voice quiet, thoughtful. "They've become attached to you." "And that concerns you," Blake surmised, his own voice carefully neutral. Catherine sighed, sinking into the plush leather chair opposite his desk. "We can't stay here forever, Blake. Eventually I'll be well enough to work again to provide for my sons properly, and then—" She left the sentence unfinished, but its stark, inevitable conclusion hung heavily, palpably in the air between them. Then they would leave. They would return to their own life, their own world. This temporary, unexpected intersection of their lives would end. "My treatments are working better than expected," Catherine continued softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor says I might be ready for reduced sessions within a month. I've started looking at apartments, places we can afford." Blake felt something cold, something akin to dread, settle in the pit of his stomach. "There's no rush," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, almost hesitant. "There is," Catherine countered gently, her gaze direct, unwavering. "The longer we stay, the harder it will be for all of us when we leave." Blake had no response. In the ruthless, cutthroat world of business, he never hesitated, never showed a moment's uncertainty. But this wasn't business. This was something else entirely, something he had deliberately, consciously avoided for years. Emotional entanglement, the inherent risk of caring too deeply, of allowing himself to be vulnerable again. "You've given us so much already," Catherine said, rising to leave, her words a gentle, painful reminder of their disparate circumstances. "We can't take advantage of your generosity forever." As she reached the door, Blake finally spoke, the words escaping, unbidden from a place deep within him he thought long dead. "And if I asked you to stay?" The question surprised them both, hanging in the air, potent, transformative. Catherine turned, her expression a complex, unreadable mixture of emotions. "Why would you?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Blake had no answer, at least none he was ready to voice aloud, not yet. That night, Blake stood before the locked door, the cold metal key trembling slightly in his hand. For 5 long, desolate years, he had preserved this room exactly as it had been on the day of the accident. Thomas's room, frozen in time, a silent, heartbreaking memorial to a life, a love, a future that had been brutally, irrevocably extinguished. His earlier conversation with Catherine echoed in his mind, her quiet, perceptive words, his own impulsive, revealing question. "And if I asked you to stay?" The words, once spoken, had taken on a life of their own, revealing more than he had intended, more than he was perhaps ready to confront. With a deep, steadying breath, Blake inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, almost mournful click that seemed to reverberate through the silent, expectant hallway. He pushed the door open slowly, cautiously, as if entering a sacred, long-forgotten tomb. Dust particles danced in the single beam of light filtering in from the corridor, illuminating a scene preserved in time. Everything remained exactly as he had left it. The blue walls covered with glow-in-the-dark solar system decals, the bookshelf overflowing with well-loved adventure stories, the small bed with its rumpled, spaceship-themed comforter that Mrs. Winters, under strict, unwavering instructions, had never been allowed to touch. On the bedside table, a framed photograph of Thomas, with Blake and his beloved wife, Sarah, all smiling, radiant, on a sun-drenched beach vacation, their last together. Blake stepped inside, an overwhelming wave of memories, of grief, of love, washing over him, threatening to drown him. He picked up a small, battered toy car from the meticulously arranged collection displayed on a shelf, a car identical, eerily so, to the one the twins had sold him. Thomas had loved cars too, his small hands often gripping them with a fierce, imaginative intensity. "Mr. Blake," he turned sharply, startled by the small, hesitant voice. Lucas stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "You shouldn't be here," Blake said, his voice hoarse, raw with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," Lucas whispered, his gaze traveling around the room, a dawning understanding, a child's intuitive empathy filling his young face. "I heard the door open. This was your son's room." Blake nodded, unable to speak, the words caught, trapped in his throat. "What was his name?" "Thomas." "Was he our age?" "He would be now. He was 5 when—" Blake couldn't finish the sentence, the pain still too acute, too unbearable. Lucas entered cautiously, approaching the framed photo on the nightstand. "You all look happy." "We were." Lucas studied the picture for a long moment, then looked up at Blake, his blue eyes, so like his mother's, filled with a simple, profound wisdom. "My mom says Dad watches over us from heaven. Maybe Thomas watches over you too." The simple, unadorned statement, delivered with a child's unwavering, innocent certainty, cracked something deep inside Blake, something he thought unbreakable, impenetrable. He sat heavily on the edge of the small bed, the carefully constructed dam of his emotions, so diligently maintained for 5 long years, finally, irrevocably breaking through. "I miss him," Blake admitted, the words barely audible, a choked whisper of grief. "Every single day." "We miss our dad too," Lucas said, sitting beside him, his small hand reaching out tentatively to touch Blake's arm. "Mom says it's okay to be sad sometimes, but we shouldn't forget to be happy too." From the doorway, a small, sharp gasp. Zach stood there, still pale from his recent illness, but his eyes wide, taking in the forbidden room, the scene before him. Behind him, Catherine appeared, her expression softening, her gaze filled with a deep, compassionate understanding as she took in the scene, the raw, unfiltered emotion. "Boys, come away," she said gently, her voice soft, soothing. "This is private." "It's all right," Blake found himself saying, the words surprising even him. "They can come in." Zach approached cautiously, his earlier fear replaced by a quiet reverence as he examined the room, its treasures, its memories. "Cool space lamp," he observed, pointing to a rocket-shaped nightlight on the bedside table. "Thomas was afraid of the dark," Blake explained, a faint, wistful smile touching his lips, surprised by how easily, how naturally the words came now after so many years of silence. "We bought this for him on his 5th birthday." Catherine remained in the doorway, a silent, supportive presence, as Blake began showing the twins Thomas's favorite books, his most cherished toys. Each object came with a story, a memory, a fragment of a life, a love Blake had locked away, buried deep within himself for so long. The pain was still there, a dull, persistent ache, but somehow sharing it, voicing it, made it bearable, almost lighter. Later, after the twins had finally, reluctantly gone to bed, their small minds filled with stories of another little boy, Catherine found Blake still in Thomas's room, sitting quietly in the dim, shadowy light. "I'm sorry they intruded," she said, her voice soft. "They're naturally curious." "Don't be," Blake replied, his voice still rough with emotion. It was time to open this door." Catherine leaned against the doorframe, her presence a quiet comfort. "It's a beautiful room. He must have been a wonderful little boy." "He was." Blake looked up at her, his gaze direct, unflinching. "The accident. It was my fault. I was driving. A truck ran a red light. I survived. They didn't." Catherine crossed the room and sat beside him, her quiet strength, her unwavering empathy, a soothing balm to his raw, wounded soul. "That's why you've isolated yourself all these years," she said, her voice filled with a gentle understanding. "You're punishing yourself." The simple, unadorned truth of her assessment left him speechless, stripped bare. "Survivor's guilt is a terrible, crushing burden," she continued softly, her hand reaching out tentatively to cover his. "But living half a life shrouded in grief, doesn't honor their memory, Blake." Blake looked into her compassionate, knowing eyes and felt, for the first time in 5 long, desolate years, like someone truly saw him, not the successful, powerful CEO, but the broken, grieving man beneath the carefully constructed, impenetrable facade. "I don't know how to stop," he confessed, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. Catherine placed her hand gently over his, her touch a silent promise of comfort, of understanding. "Maybe," she said softly, "you've already started." Spring arrived, unfurling its vibrant tapestry across the estate grounds, mirroring the subtle yet profound transformation taking place within its inhabitants. The meticulously manicured garden, a space Blake had maintained with detached precision but rarely truly enjoyed, now became a cherished sanctuary, a vibrant playground where the twins explored daily, their laughter echoing through the once silent air. Catherine's health improved steadily, her natural radiance returning, her strength rebuilding with each passing week. Most remarkably transformed, however, was Blake himself. The change occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, so subtly that an outside observer might not immediately notice. But Catherine, with her keen, empathetic perception, observed how his rigid, almost unyielding posture softened almost imperceptibly whenever the boys entered a room, how genuine, spontaneous smiles occasionally, unexpectedly, replaced his customary stern, unreadable expression. One sunny Saturday, Blake surprised everyone by canceling his usual weekend work session, a sacrosanct ritual, and suggesting almost casually that they all visit the city's renowned natural history museum. "Really?" Zach exclaimed, nearly dropping his cereal spoon in astonishment, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The new dinosaur exhibit just opened," Blake said, his tone carefully nonchalant, as if family outings, spontaneous adventures were commonplace for him. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer something else." "Dinosaurs are perfect," Lucas confirmed enthusiastically, his face alight with excitement. Catherine watched this unexpected exchange with quiet, thoughtful amazement. "Are you sure, Blake?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of surprise and a burgeoning, fragile hope. "You usually work on Saturdays." "Work can wait," he replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly, a silent, shared understanding passing between them, an acknowledgement of how truly significant, how utterly uncharacteristic. This statement was for a man who had built his entire life, his very identity, around his company, his relentless pursuit of success. The museum trip marked a subtle yet significant turning point. For the first time, they ventured out together, beyond the sterile confines of medical appointments, as a visible, cohesive unit, a nascent family that inevitably drew curious, speculative glances from museum staff and other visitors who recognized the famous, reclusive CEO accompanied by an unfamiliar woman and 2 identical, exuberant boys. Blake, normally hyper-aware, almost painfully so, of public perception, seemed remarkably, refreshingly indifferent to the attention, his focus solely on the boys, on their uninhibited joy. "Look, Mr. Blake," Zach called out, his voice filled with awe as he pointed excitedly at a massive, towering T-Rex skeleton. "This one's even bigger than the model in your library." Blake found himself caught up in their infectious enthusiasm, patiently, thoughtfully answering their endless, often imaginative questions about prehistoric creatures with information gleaned from books he'd read to Thomas, his own son, so many years ago, memories now tinged with a bittersweet warmth rather than a crushing, unbearable pain. When Lucas, in his excitement, took his hand to drag him toward the next fascinating exhibit, Blake didn't pull away, an instinctive, unthinking acceptance of physical connection, of spontaneous affection, that would have been utterly unthinkable, almost unimaginable, mere months earlier. Watching from a nearby bench while the 3 of them, Blake, Zach, and Lucas, examined a fossil display with rapt attention, Catherine felt a complicated, almost overwhelming mixture of emotions. Blake, the once intimidating, unapproachable benefactor, had transformed, evolved into something else entirely, something unexpected, something precious. A man who genuinely, deeply cared for her sons, a man who had, against all odds, opened himself to connection, to love, despite his painful, tragic past. The most troubling, the most disquieting realization wasn't that she was profoundly, overwhelmingly grateful for his kindness, his generosity. It was that she was growing attached, deeply, irrevocably attached, in ways that went far beyond mere gratitude, ways that both thrilled and terrified her. "Ice cream," Blake suggested, as they exited the museum, his gaze falling on a brightly colored vendor's cart across the street. The twins didn't need to be asked twice, racing ahead with shouts of joyful anticipation. Catherine and Blake followed at a slower, more leisurely pace. "Thank you for today," she said, her voice soft, sincere. "I haven't seen them this excited, this carefree in a very long time." "I enjoyed it too," Blake admitted, a hint of surprise in his own voice. "More than I expected." "You're good with them," Catherine observed, her gaze thoughtful, appraising. "Patient, not many men would be." Blake watched the twins as they animatedly compared ice cream flavors at the counter, their small faces alight with a pure, unadulterated joy. "They make it easy," he said, his voice quiet. "They're remarkable children." "You've given them something invaluable, Blake," Catherine said softly, her eyes meeting his. "Stability, security, a male presence they can trust, they can look up to." Blake turned to her, his expression serious, almost vulnerable. "Catherine, about what you said last week, about looking for an apartment." "Blake," she interrupted gently, her voice soft but firm, "we can't stay in your world forever. You've already done more, so much more than anyone could ever expect." "What if I want you to stay?" The words, once spoken, hung in the air between them, heavy, laden with unspoken implications, with the weight of a shared, uncertain future. Neither was ready, not yet, to fully address the profound, transformative question. Before Catherine could respond, the twins returned, proudly displaying their elaborate, dripping ice cream concoctions, their faces smeared with chocolate and strawberry. "Mr. Blake, can we go to the park next weekend?" Lucas asked eagerly, his eyes shining with anticipation. "Perhaps," Blake replied, his gaze glancing briefly, significantly at Catherine. "We'll see." That evening, as the twins, still buzzing with the excitement of their museum adventure, recounted every detail to a smiling, indulgent Mrs. Winters, Blake found Catherine in Thomas's room. She stood by the bookshelf, her fingers gently tracing the outline of a model airplane hanging from the ceiling, a silent, poignant tribute to a life, a love, a dream that had been lost. "I used to imagine leaving was the right thing," she said without turning, her voice quiet, contemplative. "For you, for us, a clean break before everyone gets too attached." She finally faced him, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, of hope, of fear, of a dawning, undeniable love. "But I'm beginning to think," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, "that might no longer be possible." Blake stepped into the room, the space no longer filled with just the ghosts of pain and memory, but with something new, something fragile, something precious, possibility. "Then don't leave," he said simply, his voice firm, resolute. Morning sunlight streamed through the expansive kitchen windows as Catherine prepared breakfast, moving with an easy, graceful confidence that reflected her steadily improving health. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm, fluffy pancakes filled the air, creating a sense of domestic tranquility, of simple, unadorned happiness that had once been utterly unimaginable in Blake's grand, austere, and emotionally barren home. "Need help?" Blake asked, entering the kitchen in casual weekend attire. A soft, worn sweater and comfortable jeans, rather than his usual impeccable corporate business suit. Catherine smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "You can set the table. The boys should be down any minute." They worked together in a comfortable, companionable silence, the routine now familiar, almost second nature, after 2 months of unexpected, transformative cohabitation. When Blake's hand accidentally brushed against hers while reaching for a stack of plates, neither pulled away immediately. A subtle, unspoken acknowledgement of the growing, undeniable connection, the burgeoning intimacy between them. "Dr. Lavine says I can reduce my treatments to once weekly," Catherine mentioned, flipping a perfectly golden pancake with practiced ease. "My kidney function has stabilized, improved beyond their initial expectations." Blake paused, a wave of relief washing over him. "That's wonderful news, Catherine." "It is," she agreed, though her tone carried a faint, almost imperceptible hint of uncertainty, of underlying anxiety. "It also means I need to think seriously about work, about our future. I can't be financially dependent forever." Before Blake could respond, thundering footsteps on the grand staircase announced the twins' energetic arrival. They burst into the kitchen, already dressed for their Saturday morning baseball practice. Another new, unexpected, and surprisingly welcome addition to the household routine. "Mom, Mr. Blake," Zach exclaimed, his face flushed with excitement. "Coach said I might pitch today." "And I'm playing first base," Lucas added proudly, not to be outdone. Breakfast conversations centered on intricate baseball strategy, impressive team standings, and optimistic predictions for the upcoming game. The earlier, more serious tension was momentarily, gratefully, set aside. Blake, who had never willingly attended a sporting event that wasn't a high-stakes corporate sponsorship opportunity, found himself genuinely, surprisingly invested in the twins' burgeoning athletic progress, their innocent, unbridled enthusiasm. At the local baseball field, Blake and Catherine sat together on the hard, unforgiving aluminum bleachers, watching the boys warm up with their equally energetic teammates. Several other parents nodded respectfully, almost reverently, toward Blake, though none dared to approach. His formidable reputation for privacy, for fiercely guarded solitude, preceded him. "They've grown," Catherine observed, her voice soft, almost wistful as she watched her sons. "Their clothes from February barely fit them now." "Children do that," Blake replied, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "Grow when you least expect it." Catherine turned to study his profile, his strong, angular features softened by the morning light. "Not just physically," she said quietly. "They're happier, more confident. That's because of you, Blake." He shook his head, uncomfortable with the directness of her praise. "They're resilient, and they have you." "But now," she said softly, her gaze unwavering, "they have you too. They talk about you constantly. Mr. Blake showed us how to use the telescope. Mr. Blake explained how airplanes fly. Mr. Blake promised to teach us new chess openings." Blake watched as Zach took his position on the pitcher's mound, his small, freckled face concentrated, focused, filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "I never expected this," Blake admitted, his voice barely audible. "Any of it." "Neither did I," Catherine replied, her own voice equally soft, equally filled with a quiet wonder. "When you appeared at our door that day, a stranger offering help, I thought you were just a wealthy man assuaging his conscience with a grand, charitable gesture." She paused, then added, her gaze meeting his. "And now?" "Now," she said, a gentle, knowing smile gracing her lips, "I know better." Their eyes met, a silent, profound communication passing between them, a shared understanding that transcended words, that spoke of shared experiences, of unexpected connections, of a future, perhaps, together. The moment was interrupted by a sudden, exuberant roar of cheers from the small crowd as Zach, with a surprisingly powerful pitch, struck out his first batter. Blake found himself on his feet, applauding more enthusiastically, more genuinely, than he had for any multi-million-dollar business achievement. Later that evening, after the twins, tired but triumphant, had finally been persuaded to go to bed, Blake and Catherine sat together on the wide, comfortable terrace. The spring air was mild, fragrant with the sweet, intoxicating scent of blooming jasmine and roses. Between them, on a small, wrought-iron table, rested the real estate listings Catherine had been discreetly, diligently researching. "These are all too far from your treatments," Blake observed, his brow furrowed as he examined the circled apartments, the neatly printed descriptions. "They're what I can afford," Catherine replied pragmatically, her voice devoid of self-pity. "I've applied for several administrative positions, jobs that would accommodate my ongoing medical schedule." Blake set the papers aside, a decisive, almost dismissive gesture. "There's another option." "Blake, hear me out," he interrupted gently, his voice firm but kind. "This house has 7 bedrooms. The boys are thriving in their current school. Your medical team, the best in the city, is nearby." He paused, gathering his courage, taking a deep, steadying breath. "Stay, not as temporary guests, not as recipients of my charity, but permanently." Catherine looked away, her profile, silhouetted against the deepening twilight, gilded by the soft, romantic glow of the rising moon. "People would talk," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They'd say I manipulated you, that the boys and I are taking advantage of your generosity, your loneliness." "Let them talk," Blake said, a sudden, unexpected fierceness in his voice, a raw, protective anger that surprised even him. "I've spent 5 long, desolate years making decisions based on what others might think, on maintaining an illusion of perfect control, of impenetrable strength. I'm tired of it, Catherine, so incredibly tired." "What exactly are you proposing, Blake?" she asked, her voice still barely audible, her gaze still fixed on the distant, star-dusted horizon. Blake reached across the small table, his hand covering hers, his touch warm, reassuring. "I'm proposing we stop pretending this is temporary, that we acknowledge openly and honestly whatever this is between us, whatever we've built together deserves a chance, a real chance." He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb caressing her soft skin. I'm not asking for immediate answers, Catherine, just don't leave, not yet. Catherine's eyes glistened in the dim, shadowy light, unshed tears reflecting the moon's soft glow. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Not of you, Blake, but of hopping again, of letting the boys hope, of risking another heartbreak. I'm afraid, too, Blake confessed, his own voice raw with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel to express in years. But for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, I'm more afraid of losing something, of losing this, than I am of having it. As the night deepened around them, its silence punctuated only by the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl, neither moved to break the fragile, poignant connection of their intertwined hands. A silent, unspoken agreement to face their fears, their uncertainties, their hopes together. Summer arrived in a blaze of glory, transforming the estate's formal, meticulously manicured gardens into a vibrant, sun-drenched playground where the twins spent endless, joyful hours exploring hidden nooks, building elaborate forts from fallen branches and discarded tarps, and occasionally with a charming, infectious enthusiasm, helping the amused, indulgent groundskeeper with simple, carefully supervised tasks. The grand, imposing mansion itself had undergone a more subtle, yet equally profound, transformation. Children's brightly colored artwork now adorned the previously sterile, stainless steel refrigerator. A chaotic, endearing jumble of colorful sneakers and muddy boots cluttered the otherwise immaculate, marble-floored entryway, and the joyful, uninhibited sound of laughter now echoed through previously silent, almost sacrosanct corridors. 3 months had passed since Blake's heartfelt, life-altering proposition on the moonlit terrace. Catherine had neither formally accepted nor explicitly rejected his offer of permanence, of a shared future, but they had fallen into a comfortable, easy rhythm, a domestic harmony that felt increasingly, undeniably, like family life. "Mom, Mr. Blake, look what we found," Lucas called out one sun-drenched Saturday morning, bursting into the bright, airy breakfast room where Blake and Catherine were quietly, companionably enjoying their morning coffee. Both boys appeared delightfully muddy and utterly, triumphantly triumphant, holding a small, bewildered turtle carefully between them. "He was by the pond," Zach explained excitedly, his eyes shining with a hunter's pride. "Can we keep him, please?" Blake glanced at Catherine, who raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow in silent, amused communication, their newfound, almost telepathic ability to converse without words, one of the many subtle, significant developments in their evolving, deepening relationship. "A turtle requires proper care, boys," Blake replied thoughtfully, his tone serious but not unkind. "Perhaps we should research what he needs first to ensure we can provide him with a suitable, healthy environment." "We could build him a habitat," Lucas suggested enthusiastically, his mind already racing with imaginative possibilities. "Mr. Blake, you said you had building supplies in the big garage, right?" "I did," Blake confirmed, surprising himself with how naturally, how easily he now included the boys in his plans, his possessions, his life. Catherine watched this heartwarming exchange with a gentle, tender smile. "Wash up first, you two. Then we can look up turtle care online." The boys dashed off, leaving a trail of muddy footprints that would have once horrified, perhaps even enraged, the meticulously ordered, obsessively private Blake, but now barely registered, a minor, almost endearing inconvenience. "You realize," Catherine said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "this means we'll be constructing a veritable turtle paradise this afternoon." "I've successfully negotiated billion-dollar multinational contracts," Blake replied dryly, a rare twinkle of humor in his eyes. "I suspect I can handle rudimentary turtle architecture." Their laughter mingled easily, a warm, harmonious sound that had become increasingly, wonderfully common in the once silent, emotionally barren mansion. The day unfolded in a delightful, unexpected tapestry of domestic harmony, diligently researching optimal turtle habitats online, gathering an assortment of surprisingly sophisticated supplies, and working together, side by side, in the sun-drenched garden to create a suitable, safe, and surprisingly elaborate home for their newly adopted reptilian visitor. Blake, who had once delegated every conceivable task, no matter how trivial, to his legion of highly efficient staff, now found himself kneeling in the dirt, patiently, enthusiastically explaining to the twins the intricate principles of proper drainage and optimal sun exposure for their new pet's habitat. Mrs. Winters, bringing a tray of refreshing lemonade to the industrious, surprisingly cohesive garden construction crew, paused to observe her employer, the formidable, often intimidating CEO, now sporting dirt-smudged khakis and a relaxed, almost boyish smile as he worked alongside the equally enthusiastic, equally dirt-smudged boys. The housekeeper exchanged a knowing, almost conspiratorial glance with Catherine, both women silently, profoundly acknowledging the remarkable, almost miraculous transformation that had taken place, not just in Blake, but in the very soul of the grand, once lonely estate. That evening, after tucking the tired but triumphant twins into bed, another cherished, newly established ritual Blake had gradually, willingly joined. He and Catherine settled in the comfortable, book-lined library with glasses of fine, aged wine. "The turtle habitat is quite impressive, I must say," Catherine commented, curling comfortably into a plush corner of the oversized, inviting sofa. "You've clearly missed your calling as an environmental engineer or perhaps a landscape architect." Blake smiled, his posture more relaxed, more at ease than she had ever seen it in their early, more formal days. "The board of directors would be utterly shocked, perhaps even apoplectic, to see me covered in mud and pond water." "Your company has been remarkably patient with your reduced schedule," Catherine observed, her tone thoughtful. "The manifold benefits of being the founder and majority shareholder," Blake replied, a hint of his old, dry wit surfacing. "Though in all seriousness, my executive team has handled things admirably, almost flawlessly in my partial and admittedly uncharacteristic absence." A comfortable, companionable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall and the distant, almost imperceptible sounds of the old house settling around them. "I received a job offer today," Catherine said finally, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, breaking the peaceful spell. "Administrative director at a local nonprofit organization. The salary is modest, certainly not what I'm accustomed to, but adequate, and they're willing to be flexible to accommodate my ongoing treatment schedule." Blake set down his wine glass carefully, his expression unreadable. "Congratulations," he said, his tone carefully, almost unnervingly measured. "When would you start?" "I haven't accepted yet," Catherine replied, watching his expression intently, searching for some clue, some indication of his true feelings. "It would mean decisions about other matters." The unspoken question, the monumental, life-altering implication, hung heavily, palpably in the air between them. Would accepting the job mean leaving the estate, leaving him, ending this beautiful, fragile, carefully constructed limbo they had been inhabiting this precious, borrowed time? "Blake," Catherine continued softly, her gaze direct, unwavering, "we've lived in this beautiful, suspended reality for months now. The boys, they consider this their home. They consider you." She hesitated, the word, so potent, so significant, catching in her throat. "Family," Blake supplied, his voice carrying a hint of a vulnerability, a raw, unshielded emotion he rarely, if ever, revealed. Catherine nodded, a single tear tracing a shimmering path down her cheek. "They've grown to love you, Blake, and I—" She stopped again, suddenly uncertain, her courage, her resolve faltering. Blake moved closer on the sofa, his hand reaching out tentatively to take hers. "And you, Catherine?" he prompted gently, his voice a soft, reassuring caress. Catherine met his gaze directly, her own eyes shining with an emotion so profound, so undeniable it took his breath away. "I've grown to love the man behind the fortress," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The man who patiently, lovingly builds turtle habitats in the garden. The man who cheers with uninhibited, boyish enthusiasm at Little League games. The man who, against all odds, opened locked doors, both literal and metaphorical." Blake's thumb traced slow, gentle circles on the back of her hand, his touch sending a shiver of anticipation, of longing through her. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "After losing Sarah and Thomas, I convinced myself it was safer, easier to feel nothing, to shut myself off from the world, from the possibility of love, of happiness." "And now," Catherine prompted gently, her heart pounding in her chest. "Now," Blake confessed, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze intense, unwavering. "Now I find myself terrified by how much I have to lose, by how essential, how utterly indispensable you and the boys have become to my life, to my very existence." Catherine leaned forward, her forehead resting gently against his, their breaths mingling, their hearts beating in a shared, synchronous rhythm. "Then ask us to stay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, with a hope so fierce, so powerful it almost frightened her. "Not as guests, Blake, not as charity cases, ask us properly." Blake sat in his office the following morning, the early sunlight streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He stared at the small, velvet-covered box resting on his polished mahogany desk. The antique ring inside, his grandmother's, a cherished family heirloom, had been locked away in a sterile, impersonal safe deposit box for 5 long, desolate years. He had retrieved it yesterday, impulsively, almost instinctively, after his profound, transformative conversation with Catherine. His mind, usually so clear, so decisive, so ruthlessly efficient, was now racing with a whirlwind of possibilities, of hopes, of fears. "Ask us properly," she had said, her voice a soft, compelling whisper that echoed in his mind, in his heart, both thrilling and utterly, profoundly terrifying. Blake Harrison, the man who made multi-million-dollar, globally impactful decisions daily, without a moment's hesitation, without a flicker of doubt, now found himself utterly, completely paralyzed by uncertainty, by the monumental, life-altering significance of this one, deeply personal decision. A gentle, hesitant knock on the door interrupted his tumultuous thoughts. "Mr. Blake?" Lucas peered around the heavy oak door, his small face etched with a child's innocent concern. "Mom said to tell you lunch is ready." "I'll be right there," Blake replied, his voice sounding distant, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. He quickly, almost furtively, slipped the ring box into his desk drawer out of sight. Lucas lingered in the doorway, his perceptive blue eyes, so like his mother's, studying Blake intently. "Are you okay? You look worried." Blake managed a smile, a weak, unconvincing imitation of his usual confident demeanor. "Just thinking about some important decisions." "About us staying?" Lucas asked, with a startling, almost unnerving directness that took Blake completely by surprise. "Zach and I, we want to stay forever." Blake's breath caught in his throat. "You do?" Lucas nodded solemnly, his small face serious, resolute. "Mom's happier here, and you're happier with us, we can tell." "You're very perceptive," Blake observed, a genuine, albeit slightly shaky, smile finally reaching his lips. The boy shrugged, a gesture of endearing, unaffected nonchalance. "Twins notice things." He hesitated for a moment, then added, his voice filled with a child's simple, unwavering certainty. "Mom loves you, you know. She smiles, different when you're around." Before Blake could respond, before he could even begin to process the profound, disarming wisdom of a 10-year-old boy, Lucas disappeared down the long, echoing hallway, leaving him stunned, speechless, by the simple, unvarnished truth of his innocent, insightful words. At lunch, Blake found himself studying Catherine across the table as she laughed, a genuine, melodious sound at something Zach, with his characteristic exuberance, had said. She caught his gaze and smiled, that special, radiant smile Lucas had mentioned, sending a warmth, a jolt of pure, unadulterated happiness spreading through his chest, through his very soul. "I thought we might visit the lake this afternoon," Blake suggested as they finished their meal, the idea forming, solidifying in his mind. "The weather's perfect for it." The twins cheered their enthusiastic approval. Blake's sprawling estate included a small, private, spring-fed lake, complete with a rustic, charming boathouse and a sturdy, well-maintained dock, which had become a favorite, almost sacred, spot for them during the long, lazy, sun-drenched days of summer. Hours later, as the sun began its slow, majestic descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange, pink, and gold, Catherine and Blake sat together on the weathered wooden dock, watching the twins splash and play in the shallow, crystal-clear water. A comfortable, companionable silence stretched between them, broken only by the boys' joyful, infectious laughter and the occasional melodic call of distant birds. "I spoke with the nonprofit director this morning," Catherine said finally, her voice quiet, contemplative, breaking the peaceful spell. "I asked for a few more days to consider their offer." Blake nodded, his fingers unconsciously, almost compulsively, touching the small, reassuring outline of the ring box in his pocket. "What's holding you back?" Catherine turned to face him fully, her gaze direct, unwavering, her eyes reflecting the fiery beauty of the setting sun. "You know exactly what's holding me back, Blake, the same thing that's had you distracted, preoccupied all day." Her expression softened, a gentle, knowing smile gracing her lips. "Whatever you're wrestling with, Blake, just say it." Blake took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of pine and lake water filling his lungs. "When I bought that toy car from the boys," he began, his voice low, almost reverent, "I never imagined, not in a million years, where it would lead. I was empty, functioning certainly on a superficial level, but not truly living. He gazed out at the twins, their small, silhouetted figures etched against the vibrant, glowing sky. Then, suddenly, unexpectedly, my house, my life, was full of noise, of chaos. Of life again. It wasn't just charity, was it? Catherine asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze searching, empathetic. Even at the very beginning. Blake shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. I told myself it was that I was just helping because I could, because it was the right thing to do. But from that very first day, seeing those twin boys, so small, so vulnerable, trying so desperately, so valiantly to save their mother. He met her eyes then, his own filled with a raw, unshielded emotion. They reminded me of Thomas. But they also reminded me, with a force, a clarity that was almost painful, of what it meant to care deeply, unconditionally about something, someone beyond myself. Catherine reached for his hand, her touch gentle, reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, his vulnerability, his burgeoning hope. And now? Now, he said, his voice thick with emotion, now I can't imagine this house, this life, without you in it, without the boys running through the halls, their laughter echoing in every room, without your smile, your warmth, your quiet strength in the kitchen, without, he squeezed her hand, his grip firm, resolute, without the family we've somehow miraculously become. The twins' splashing grew more distant as they chased each other along the sandy shoreline, their joyful shouts carried on the gentle evening breeze, giving the adults a precious, uninterrupted moment of privacy, of intimacy. I used to think I didn't deserve happiness, Blake continued, his voice raw with a grief, a guilt he had carried silently, stoically for so long. That surviving when Sarah and Thomas didn't was some kind of cosmic punishment, a cruel, unbearable penance I was doomed to pay for the rest of my days. And now, Catherine prompted again, her voice a soft, gentle caress. Now, he said, a new, unfamiliar note of hope, of conviction in his voice, now I think, maybe they would want this, for me, for us. Blake reached into his pocket and withdrew the small, velvet-covered ring box. I've been carrying this around all day, he confessed, a sheepish, almost boyish grin gracing his lips, trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words. Catherine's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat as he opened the box, revealing a vintage, exquisitely crafted emerald, surrounded by a halo of glittering, brilliant-cut diamonds, a ring that seemed to capture, to reflect, the very essence of the vibrant, life-affirming beauty of the setting sun. I'm not offering you security, Catherine, Blake said, his voice steady now despite the frantic, joyful pounding of his heart. Or stability, or financial support, those things I know you can and will achieve on your own. He took her hand, his gaze intense, unwavering, filled with a love so profound, so undeniable it seemed to illuminate the very air around them. I'm offering you partnership, family. A life together, a shared journey that honors both our pasts, our histories, our heartbreaks, but isn't defined, isn't imprisoned by them. He took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. Catherine Wilson, will you and your remarkable, wonderful sons make this house a home permanently? Will you marry me? Catherine's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound, so overwhelming, it seemed to eclipse everything else. For a moment that stretched, suspended into eternity, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, her heart too full for words. Then slowly, exquisitely, she nodded. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Blake will stay. Yes, I'll marry you. Blake slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling, unsteady hands, then pulled her close, their kiss gentle at first, a tender acknowledgement of all they had been through, then deepening, igniting with the passionate, unwavering promise of shared futures, of healing hearts, of a love that had, against all odds, found its way home. They broke apart, breathless at the sound of approaching, exuberant footsteps. The twins ran toward them, dripping wet, their faces alight with curiosity, their eyes wide with a child's intuitive understanding that something momentous, something wonderful had just occurred. What's happening? Zach asked, noticing his mother's tears, Blake's uncharacteristically emotional, almost radiant expression. Catherine extended her hand, her fingers splayed, showing them the glittering emerald ring. Mr. Blake, she said, her voice filled with a joy that seemed to bubble up from the very depths of her soul, has asked us to stay, permanently, as a family. The boys stared at the ring, then at the adults, their small faces a mixture of astonishment, disbelief, and dawning, unadulterated delight, as they slowly, joyfully processed this incredible, life-altering information. Does that mean you're getting married? Lucas asked cautiously, his voice barely a whisper. Blake nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. If that's all right with you both. The twins exchanged one of their characteristic, silent, almost telepathic communications, then broke into identical ear-to-ear grins. "Does this mean we can call you Dad?" Zach asked boldly, his voice filled with a hopeful, almost reverent anticipation. Question, so simple, so profound, hit Blake with an unexpected, overwhelming force. He had been prepared for hesitation, for a gradual transition, for the understandable complexities of blending two families, two lives, two histories. Instead, these remarkable, resilient boys offered him immediate, unconditional acceptance, a gift so precious, so profound, he thought he'd never receive it again. "I would be honored," Blake said, his voice rough with emotion, thick with unshed tears. "But only when you're ready." The twins launched themselves forward, wrapping their small, strong arms around both adults in an enthusiastic, joyous group hug that nearly toppled everyone into the cool, refreshing waters of the lake. Laughter and tears mingled freely as the newly officially defined family held each other close, the setting sun casting them in a warm, golden, almost ethereal light, a perfect, poignant tableau of love, of healing, of new beginnings. Later that night, as the twins slept soundly, their small faces peaceful, Content and Catherine admired her ring in the soft, silvery moonlight streaming through their bedroom window, Blake found himself thinking of Thomas. For the first time, the memory brought not a crushing, unbearable pain, but a bittersweet, almost gentle joy, a quiet, profound sense of peace, a comforting, almost tangible sense that his beloved son would approve, would rejoice in the unexpected, miraculous family his father had found. In his pocket, Blake still carried the twins' small, battered red toy car, no longer a symbol of painful endings, of irreparable loss, but now a cherished, precious talisman of unexpected beginnings, of second chances, of the enduring, transformative power of love. Blake Harrison, once known, almost exclusively, for his formidable business acumen and his fiercely guarded, reclusive nature, now found himself the subject of entirely different kinds of whispers, of intrigued, speculative murmurs, as he, Catherine, and the twins entered the opulent, glittering ballroom for the annual charity gala. 6 months had passed since his heartfelt, life-altering proposal by the lake. The public announcement of their engagement had, predictably, created significant ripples, waves of astonishment and conjecture throughout Boston's elite, often insular social circles. Blake, called Richard Thornton, the distinguished, silver-haired chairman of Blake's board of directors, his voice booming with a mixture of surprise and genuine pleasure. "We were beginning to think you'd become entirely, perhaps even permanently, domestic these days." Blake guided Catherine forward, his hand resting lightly, possessively at the small of her back, a subtle, protective gesture. "Richard, I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Catherine Wilson." Catherine, elegant and poised in a midnight blue, floor-length gown that perfectly complemented the deep, verdant fire of the emerald on her finger, extended her hand with a quiet, understated confidence. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thornton. Blake speaks very highly of your business partnership, your astute counsel." Richard's expression betrayed a fleeting, momentary surprise before he recovered his customary polished, affable charm. "The pleasure is all mine, my dear. Blake has been different these past few months. Happier, more alive. Now I understand why." As they moved gracefully through the crowded, glittering ballroom, Blake introduced Catherine to a succession of colleagues, business associates, and long-standing acquaintances. Some responded with genuine warmth, with sincere, heartfelt congratulations. Others with a barely concealed, almost palpable curiosity about the enigmatic, seemingly ordinary woman who had, against all odds, captured the heart of Boston's most notoriously elusive, most eligible widower. "They're wondering what my angle is," Catherine murmured, a hint of amusement in her voice, as they stepped onto the polished dance floor, the orchestra's romantic waltz filling the air. The struggling single mother who somehow, miraculously, ensnared the reclusive, grieving billionaire. Blake drew her closer, their bodies moving smoothly, effortlessly to the music's gentle, lilting rhythm. "Let them wonder," he said, his voice low, intimate for her ears only. "We know the truth." Catherine smiled up at him, her eyes shining with a love so profound, so undeniable it seemed to illuminate the very air around them. "Which is?" "That asterisk, I'm the fortunate one," Blake replied, his voice husky with emotion, with a sincerity that resonated deep within his soul. "That somehow, against all logic, all reason, all expectation, I was given a second chance at happiness, a happiness I never thought I deserved, a happiness I thought lost to me forever." Later that evening, as they drove home through the quiet, sleeping city, Catherine rested her head contentedly against Blake's shoulder, her hand resting gently, possessively on his thigh. "The boys will want a full, detailed report," she said, a soft, sleepy smile playing on her lips. "Zach was utterly convinced you'd be eating from golden plates, and Lucas was certain there would be actual, real-life princesses in attendance." Blake chuckled, a warm, rich sound that filled the quiet intimacy of the car. "Wait until they hear about the life-sized chocolate fountain. That should fuel their imaginations for weeks." They found Mrs. Winters in the spacious, comfortable living room, patiently reading to the twins, who had stubbornly, valiantly refused to sleep until their mother and Blake returned home from their fancy party. "Mom, Dad," Zach exclaimed, the term dad now a natural, cherished, and comfortably established part of their daily lexicon. Blake still felt a profound, almost overwhelming surge of emotion, of gratitude each time the boys called him Dad, a title he thought he'd never hear again, a role he thought he'd never have the chance, the privilege to fill again. "How was the fancy party?" "Less exciting than you'd probably imagine," he replied, loosening his tie, a gesture of comfortable domesticity that would have once been unthinkable. "Mostly just grown-ups talking about boring, grown-up things." "Did you dance?" Lucas asked, scrambling to make room on the plush, oversized sofa for them, his eyes wide with a child's innocent curiosity. Catherine kicked off her elegant, high-heeled shoes with a sigh of profound relief. "We did. Your future dad, as it turns out, is surprisingly good at it." The twins looked suitably impressed, their small faces alight with a mixture of awe and admiration. "Can you teach us?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with hopeful anticipation. "For when we go to fancy parties too." "Of course," Blake promised, settling beside them on the comfortable sofa, an arm draped casually, protectively around Catherine's shoulders. "Though those particular fancy parties might be a few years away yet." Mrs. Winters excused herself, a warm, knowing smile gracing her lips as she observed the heartwarming family tableau, so vastly, wonderfully different from the solitary, often melancholic evenings that had once defined this grand, imposing household. "I got an A on my science project," Zach announced proudly, his chest puffing out with a child's endearing, unself-conscious pride. "Mrs. Peterson said my ecosystem model was exceptional. And I got picked for the school play," Lucas added, not to be outdone, his own face beaming with a similar, well-deserved sense of accomplishment. Catherine and Blake exchanged glances of shared parental pride, their hearts swelling with a love so profound, so all-encompassing, it seemed to fill the very air around them. These ordinary, everyday achievements, homework, school activities, small, personal triumphs, and occasional character-building failures had become the precious, irreplaceable fabric of their shared, interwoven life. Later, after the twins had finally, reluctantly been persuaded to bed, their small minds filled with dreams of chocolate fountains and future fancy parties, Blake and Catherine stood together in the quiet, dimly lit doorway of Thomas's room. It was no longer a shrine to grief, a painful, locked-away reminder of a devastating loss, but now a gentle, loving memorial space, where photographs of both their past and present families shared equal, honored space. Blake had initially suggested converting it to a proper, functional bedroom for one of the twins, but Catherine, with her characteristic wisdom and empathy, had insisted otherwise. "He's part of our family story too, Blake," she'd said, her voice soft but firm. "We don't erase the past. We build on it. We honor it." Now, as their wedding plans progressed, as their lives intertwined more completely, more irrevocably, with each passing day, Blake realized, with a profound, humbling clarity, how right, how incredibly wise she had been. The room had transformed, much like Blake himself, from a somber, heartbreaking shrine to grief into a hopeful, loving bridge between their past and their shared, bright future. "3 weeks until the wedding," Catherine said softly, leaning her head contentedly against his strong shoulder. "Having second thoughts?" Blake teased gently, pulling her closer, his arm encircling her waist. "Only about letting the twins be in charge of the rings," she confessed, a playful lilt in her voice. "I'm envisioning a rather dramatic, perhaps even chaotic, chase scene mid-ceremony." Catherine laughed, a warm, melodious sound that filled the quiet stillness of the night. "They promised, crossed their hearts, to be on their absolute best behavior, and Mrs. Winters, in a stroke of genius, threatened to withhold dessert for a month if they misbehave in any way." "A powerful, almost irresistible incentive," Blake agreed, a smile playing on his lips as he turned off the light, plunging the room into a soft, comforting darkness as they left. Though in all honesty, he added, his voice suddenly serious, his gaze intense, I wouldn't care if the entire ceremony descended into utter, complete chaos, as long as at the end of it all you're my wife, and we're officially, irrevocably a family. Catherine kissed him softly, a tender, lingering kiss filled with love, with promise, with a shared, profound understanding. We already are, Blake, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. We already are the wedding. It just makes it official. The garden radiated with the breathtaking, vibrant glory of springtime. Roses, in a riot of exuberant color, climbed gracefully up ornate trellises. Delicate, fragrant cherry blossoms carpeted the winding, sun-dappled pathways, and warm, golden sunlight filtered through the lush, verdant canopy of ancient trees, dappling the assembled, expectant guests. 1 year to the very day since Blake's heartfelt, life-altering proposal by the lake, family and close, cherished friends gathered to witness not merely a wedding, but a profound, joyous renewal of vows, a celebration of love, of healing, of second chances. Catherine, radiant and breathtakingly beautiful in an elegant, ivory lace gown, stood opposite Blake, her eyes shining with a love so profound, so undeniable. It seemed to illuminate the very air around them, beneath a magnificent arch adorned with fragrant, cascading flowers. Between them stood Zach and Lucas, handsome and proud in their matching, perfectly tailored suits, their small faces bright with joy, with a solemn, endearing sense of importance, as they held the velvet cushions bearing the simple, elegant wedding rings. 1 year ago, the officiant began, his voice warm, resonant, these four souls officially, joyfully became a family. Today, they celebrate that remarkable journey, that transformative path, and renew the sacred, heartfelt promises they made to each other, to their shared future. Blake gazed at Catherine, his heart swelling with a love, a gratitude so profound, so overwhelming, it almost took his breath away, still amazed, still humbled by the miracle of her presence, her love, her unwavering faith in his life. When I met two small, determined boys selling a battered, cherished toy car in the park, he said, his voice steady, clear, filled with a certainty, a conviction that resonated deep within his soul. I never imagined, not in my wildest dreams, that they would lead me back to life, back to love, back to hope. He turned his gaze briefly, lovingly, to Zach and Lucas, then back to Catherine, his eyes shining with unshed tears. You, Catherine, and your remarkable, wonderful sons, healed wounds I thought permanent, incurable. You turned my cold, empty house back into a warm, loving home. Catherine squeezed his hands, her own eyes glistening with tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had, against all odds, triumphed over grief, over loss, over despair. You saved us, Blake, she said, her voice thick with emotion. In every way a family can be saved, but more importantly, more profoundly, you loved us. Not out of obligation, not out of charity, but with your whole magnificent heart. The twins, with perfect, endearing solemnity, presented the rings. As Blake slipped the simple, elegant gold band onto Catherine's finger, he noted with a surge of profound, almost overwhelming emotion, the delicate, almost imperceptible engraving inside. Second chances. Life, in its mysterious, often unpredictable ways, had indeed come full circle. What began with a small, battered red toy car, a desperate, heartfelt plea for help, had transformed, alchemized into something beautiful, something precious, something enduring, a testament, a shining, irrefutable proof that even the most wounded, the most broken hearts could find healing, could find solace, could find love through love's unexpected, often miraculous pathways.